when I stood up to make my maiden speech, it was packed, following on our side Ted Heath. And I said, Mr. Speaker, it's a great honour for me to address the House for the first time. And she piped up, and about time too. And the whole place went completely silent. And there I was, I had these little postcards, which John Major, who was my whip then, had helped me to write. You do 10 minutes, so I had 10 cards, helped me to write. So then it was explained to me that she was very, very ambitious. Michael, who I knew both of them extremely well, obviously, and then it was explained to me that Michael, who was older, was also very ambitious as well. But it wasn't immediately obvious to me because I wasn't part of this group, which of course still exists today, of candidates who expect to win and are working because they're certain to win as far as they're concerned, and then immediately start operating. I'm not going to share with you, Ian, who of the 2019 intake operated like that, but there are some.
What was your first encounter with Margaret Thatcher?
When I was asked to take part in her first party political broadcast as leader. There was a young lady and a chap called Ted Atwell. He was sort of seen as Alf Garnett, really. And Margaret, she had a weakness for all sorts of things, but she did have a weakness for that sort of conservative. So this sort of transit van type affair pulled up in Smith Square, and we all got into it. So we spent the journey from Smith Square to Elstree Film Studios, and during the whole of the journey was Ted Atwell sat next to her. He never shut up throughout the whole of the journey. And you know, there are some people who keep doing that to get your attention. He was doing that. I thought, well, goodness sake, will you shut up, man? He kept on and on and on. Got to the studio. Margaret was very nice to the young lady who I think was wearing, she wasn't undressed, but she needed a bit of covering up, so she got a cardigan or something for her. We started the programme and there was a cot and a baby in the cot. I don't know how we did it, but there was a ball and chain round the baby's leg, and that was representing the debt of the Labour Party. Well, he couldn't do it. Every time he was asked to do his bit, he just froze completely. We had take after retake after retake. And I thought, this woman, she was so lovely, so down to earth, not like the way some people portrayed her.
That was the late Sir David Amess, who's been honoured this week with a plaque in the House of Commons 2 years after he was murdered while working in his constituency. He spoke to me just a few months before that. You can listen to that full interview and all the other episodes of the Iain Dale All Talk podcast by finding it on Global Player and hitting subscribe. Coming up in the next hour, it's Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. Joining me on the panel are the author and journalist Rachel Shabi, Ali Milani, who is an author, political commentator and chairs the Labour Muslim Network, Lord Stewart Jackson, Conservative peer, former MP and special advisor, and Cindy Yu, assistant editor of The Spectator, and she reminds me, presenter of the Chinese Whispers podcast. Can never have too many podcasts, can you? 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question over the course of the next 60 minutes. You can text 84850. You can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the head of the UN says he's shocked at accusations. He's justifying terrorism by saying the Hamas attacks on Gaza didn't happen in a vacuum. Antonio Guterres says he's always been clear nothing could ever excuse or explain the horror of what's happened. Defence Secretary Grant Shapps says other countries could help with resolving the conflict.
It's very important at this moment that the world doesn't allow this appalling terrorist incident by Hamas to tip over into something regional or bigger.
The first British plane supplying aid has been sent to Egypt. The former Conservative MP, Peter Bone, has been suspended from the House of Commons for 6 weeks. He was found to have committed bullying and sexual misconduct against a staff member. It could lead to a by-election in his constituency of Wellingborough. And Mike Johnson, an ally of Donald Trump, has been elected Speaker of the US House of Representatives. The House has been without a Speaker, one of the most powerful political positions in the US, for the last 3 weeks after the ousting of Kevin McCarthy. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 25 points at 74.14. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.15. LBC weather: light rain in the northeast tonight, with showers moving northeastwards across the rest of the country, a low of 6. Another cloudy day tomorrow with rain for most areas, windy in the west with a high of 15 Celsius. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Joining me on the panel for the next hour, Rachel Shabi, who's an author and journalist, Ali Milani, author and political commentator, lots of authors on the programme tonight, and he chairs the Labour Muslim Network. Lord Jackson, Stewart Jackson, Conservative peer, former MP for Peterborough and former special advisor to various Brexit secretaries, I think I'm right in saying, aren't I?
Just one.
Just one, was it? I thought you'd done a few more. And Cindy Yu, who is assistant editor of The Spectator and the presenter of the Chinese Whispers podcast. The number to call if you'd like to put a question to them, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And don't forget to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's take a first question from Clive in Miami. Hello, Clive.
Hi. How can Keir Starmer provide a nuanced approach to the Israel-Hamas conflict without losing one side or the other?
We've been talking about this over the last hour on the programme, in that he's had a meeting today with Muslim Labour MPs in the light of 150 Muslim Labour councillors resigning over his comments on the siege of Gaza. Ali Milani, as chair of the Labour Muslim Network, I imagine you have a view on this.
I do. I just want to say, first of all, 150 haven't resigned. They've written a letter. And
I thought they'd actually resigned from the party.
Now it's 250 councillors who have written a letter to Sir Keir Starmer asking for the party to adopt a position of an immediate ceasefire, which is not only we know the British population agrees with according to YouGov polls, but also we've heard it from everyone from the UN all the way to the Archbishop of Canterbury. I think this is a really, really good question, and the large parts is I'm really getting sick as someone who's Muslim and has received death threats in the last sort of 2 weeks as this issue has gone on, that we don't allow hate to take over our city, our communities, and we deal with what is a very, very difficult crisis, respectfully, openly, and morally. And I think the way to do that is to approach the issue honestly and with humanitarian law and international law in mind. I think the way that Sir Keir Starmer can do that is by acknowledging the call from Muslim community members today that an immediate ceasefire is the position that the party should now take, in line with human rights organisations, the UN, and the British public.
But he clearly doesn't believe that.
Well, I'm hoping he changes his mind. Look, the reality is we now have 200 hostages. We think around 200 hostages, which should be released. We've had 1,400 Israelis lose their lives tragically in a heinous terror attack. We also now have 1,000 Palestinian children who've died under rubble, nearly 6,000 Palestinian citizens who are dead now, and they bear no responsibility for what has happened over the last 2 weeks, and they bear no responsibility and have no power in what happens over the next 2 weeks. And so the release of the hostages is absolutely the right call. So is an immediate ceasefire.
Should that not be a precondition for a ceasefire, though? If the Israelis said, look, you release the hostages, we will have a ceasefire. Surely that would seem to be most people to be equitable.
I don't know. Perhaps I don't know what the negotiations are taking place. It's difficult because we're so far removed from it. But the two things are absolutely linked. But the reality is, I mean, look. One of the biggest concerns that exists right now from a human perspective, even if you take the Muslim or Christian or any faith or none out of it, there are hospitals in Gaza right now where there are children in incubators that have hours until that incubator switches off, right? That child isn't a hostage negotiator, nor do they have hostages. Turning off that incubator is a war crime, first of all, the denial of water, power and essential supplies into Gaza, the cutting off and collective punishment is a war crime. But it's also wrong. And I think all communities can rally behind that it's wrong for that child to have to suffer and die.
But Hamas could immediately solve that by releasing the hostages.
But that child bears no responsibility to that, Ian. That child can't go talk to Hamas and say, release the hostages. We're a democracy and we believe in international law and we believe in humanitarianism. I'll give you an example. It's like, imagine someone in London or a group had committed the most heinous act on London. Nobody in their right mind would suggest starving London of food, of water, of cutting off its power supply, of allowing children to die in hospitals who bear no responsibility. They're not Hamas, and they bear no responsibility to that. That's a moral position. It's easy. They don't. But
we don't
have to be Palestinian.
But you're putting all of the moral responsibility on Israel here when it was Hamas who launched the terror attack in the first place and have got these hostages. And all they would have to do, at least to show a sign of goodwill, if nothing else, would be to release the hostages. And then I think there would be a huge pressure on the Israeli government to have a ceasefire.
Obviously, I'm not Hamas.
I know, and I certainly wasn't implying that you.
I mean, if it was me, I would release the hostages. But what I'm saying is, it's not me, and it's not any of us. We're a liberal democracy. We believe in international law and humanitarian law, right? We believe in the value and the humanity of those hostages' lives, but we also believe in the value and humanity of all those innocent people. 6,000 dead under rubble. 1 in 20 buildings now flattened. Who of any moral standing cannot call that out, not only as a war crime, but the wrong thing to do?
Rachel Shabi, you and I used to be on a panel on a programme called CNN Talk, and I can remember talking about Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semitism a lot on that programme at the time. Do you think that Keir Starmer's views on this are almost subliminally being guided by the need to rescue the Labour Party's reputation, which, to be fair, over the last 3 years, he's done on this issue, but now it seems to be in jeopardy again?
You know, I really would hope that he isn't doing that, because those two are completely separate things. And actually conflating those two things makes things worse, both in terms of his position on Israel-Gaza, which has been horrendous, and in terms of anti-Semitism, which would absolutely be worsened by him being subliminally guided by that, as you suggest. I think I don't know what he's being guided by, but what I know is definitely the case is that he has no moral backbone right now. And the people who he's listening to do not know what they're talking about. This is a really low bar. It really is. All we are saying is, can you just ask Israel to comply with humanitarian law and international law? And we're asking this of a guy who's a human rights lawyer, for crying out loud. If he cannot tell the difference, if he cannot summon the will right now to say, my understanding of human rights law and the basic rules of engagement is that you do not respond to a war crime with another war crime. And by the way, that answers the question you asked Ali. You do not starve people of water and fuel and food, commit a war crime, because a war crime has been committed against you. That is the basics of the engagement of the rule of law when it comes to war. And that's why that's not happening. And that's why that's a war crime for Israel to do that. And for Keir Starmer to not be able to say very clearly, that is a breach of humanitarian law. You have to call for a ceasefire, which, by the way, there's overwhelming majority British support for. You have to lift the siege on Gaza so humanitarian aid can go in. These are very basic things.
Do you think Egypt is committing a war crime? Because they've effectively part of the siege on Gaza, aren't they?
Well, Egypt it's not able to decide whether Rafah is open or closed unless Israel says so. I mean, that's how that situation works.
Well, how does that work? Because it's the border with Egypt.
That's literally how the agreement with Israel works. Seriously, they are not able. Look, if Egypt was able to decide to open Rafah, do you not think that for the last 2 weeks, that long queue of lorries with humanitarian aid that was trying to get into Gaza, do you not think that would have gone in by now?
I think the reason that Egypt has closed its border is because it doesn't want hundreds of thousands of refugees crossing into Egypt from Gaza. That's presumably why they closed it.
Come on, you could open a border to let lorries in and not let people out. I mean, this is basic stuff. Come on, Iain. The reason it doesn't want Gazans to go through Rafah to Egypt is because it fears that Israel will not let those Palestinians back into Gaza. It fears that there is a giant ethnic cleansing plan going on here, and rightly.
What a pity Egypt didn't want to take Gaza as a territory when it was offered it, but way back when. Well, we wouldn't have this situation for a start, would we?
No. Let's not impose weird scenarios. The reason we have
weird scenario. It happened.
The reason we have this situation is because we have an unequal. This is not like an equal battle between Palestinians and Israel. We have a situation where for over 50 years now, Palestinians have been under military occupation, and it is brutal. It is brutal every single day.
Okay,
right?
well,
and that has got nothing to do with Egypt.
Because
that's got nothing to do with Egypt.
We can't go back to the history, through the whole history of the Palestinian situation.
Maybe you should, Iain.
Well, we have done many times over the last couple of weeks, I can assure you. Stewart Jackson.
Well, I don't agree with the history, but I won't go. I mean, Egypt attacked Israel in 1967, and so Gaza has been a contested territory. Israel unilaterally left Gaza and left a functioning economy, utilities, infrastructure, education, hospitals. It was Hamas who decided to murder their opponents and have a totalitarian jihadist regime there, and is an existential threat to the people of Israel. And let's not repeat in this canard that Israel is breaking international law. The very eminent barrister Lord Vedarami last night demolished that argument in the debate in the Lords. He's an international law specialist. Israel is not breaking international law. My view is that to leave Hamas in place in Gaza will be a catastrophe for the Palestinian people. This is an absolutely appalling situation, but it is...
Can we go back to the question on Keir Starmer, though?
Okay. I was just going to say, we have to think long term what's good for the Palestinian people as well as the Israeli people, and Hamas is not the answer to the question. In terms of Keir Starmer, ultimately he has to play to the national interest and not party interest. He's a serious politician. He aspires to be the Prime Minister. He has to think in terms of what is in the national interest, and he's got to steer away from this internecine post-Corbynist approach that identitarian politics means that he has to fall into line and attack Israel. I think he's taken a very moderate view. I think he is prepared to...
He's taken a more hardline view than Rishi Sunak.
Quite possibly. And I think you're right, Iain. I mean, you're an old cynic, of course, in politics. But, he knows full well that people are watching him now and they're gauging whether he looks like a man that can stand on the steps of number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. And it is a tough test for him, and it will be a difficult few weeks. But I think he's made the right call.
Cindy?
Yeah, I agree with much of what Stuart's just said as well. When it comes to, Rachel, you raised a question of why Keir Starmer is doing this. I think it's not just the ghost of Corbyn, it's also the pressure of going into government possibly next year. The fact that this is the American position, and frankly, any prospective Prime Minister of this country needs to be looking at the American position on foreign policy issues, whether it's on Israel-Palestine or China or Russia, whatever it is. We might not like it, but frankly, that is the thing that we have to do as a country.
When did we become the 51st state?
That's kind of a separate question, and let's maybe not open that kind of work.
I mean, that worked really well over Iraq and Afghanistan, didn't it? That was a great idea.
I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I'm just saying that if you want to be a Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, you need to be on the same page as America, or at least as other Western developed countries. And actually, you know what? A lot of European countries have taken this strategy, have taken this position of not calling for a ceasefire, but of going to Israel and saying to Netanyahu, behind the scenes, moderation, but no one is coming out to call for it. And I'm not talking about
the European Union did exactly that yesterday.
Sure, except but the European Union is also split on this question as well, by the way. So I just think it's, from a political perspective, set aside the kind of the moral and the values here, because I completely cast down. I do not know enough about the situation, about the history involved here, to be able to opine and, give an authoritative view on it. But on the political analysis, that's why he's doing it. And I think it's a smart political strategy for them to be taking. You've already got the Labour Party, which is confused on foreign policy. You look at China, it doesn't really seem to have a position on China that's that much different. You've got David Lammy, your foreign secretary, who might be coming in, who actually campaigned against Donald Trump coming to London a few years ago, and Trump might be president next year. So from Labour Party's perspective, if you want to be a prospective government in waiting, this is really what you have to do. And I think the thing that will move the dial is if the situation eases up, is if Washington, which it looks like it might be doing, eases up its own position and says, actually, Netanyahu, you've gone too far here. And, that might happen. And that's an absolute cop-out.
I think the most fascinating thing about this whole thing is that Israel has not launched a ground invasion yet. I emphasise yet. Now, why is that? It must be because the Americans in particular, plus Britain and other countries, have urged Netanyahu not to do it,
100%.
which is an indication of his weakness in his political position as Prime Minister of Israel, something which we wouldn't have said maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Well, I think it's two things, Ian, if I may say. I think one is the actual logistics of a ground war is going to be very, very difficult, and the Israelis have been burnt in Lebanon.
Yeah, but they've had plans for this for years.
They have had plans, but, street by street, ground fight is going to be very hard. The other thing is, politically, of course, they don't know what's going to happen. Even if they expunge the evil barbarians of Hamas out and start talking to the Palestinian representatives like Fatah, who may or may not want to be the government of Gaza, they don't know where
they don't exist in Gaza, as I understand.
Well, they don't,
in any meaningful way.
But the point is, no one quite knows what the end game, the end political objective will be, and that's why you do need Qatar, the Saudis, the Egyptians, and others. You have a multilateral approach to try and solve this crisis.
Right, we will take more questions in just a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
21 minutes past 8, we have the journalist Rachel Shabi, Ali Milani, chair of the Labour Muslim Network. We have Lord Jackson, Stewart Jackson, Conservative peer, and Cindy Yu, assistant editor of The Spectator. Soon to be editor, I'm sure. See, she's not denying it. I'll report back to Fraser. Callum in Preston is our next caller. Hello, Callum.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. With Peter Bone being suspended today and the potential triggering of another by-election, would it not make more sense for the government to call a general election now to avoid facing just another humiliating by-election defeat?
Well, just have a complete humiliation of a massive defeat, more generally, you mean. Now, we should explain that the system here is that because Peter Bone has been suspended for 6 weeks, that triggers a recall petition. So 10% of his constituents have to call, I think this is right, Stewart, have to call for a by-election in which he could stand. So it's all rather complicated, but the most likely outcome, I think, is that there will be another by-election. Cindy, let's start with you.
Well, I've never met a politician who's wanted to go into an election with 20 points behind the polls. So I think, as much as Callum's instincts might be, oh, God, let's just get this over with now, I just don't think that's what informs politicians. That's not what drives them. So if Rishi Sunak can have until January 2025 to have an election, I would be surprised if he calls one this side of Christmas, even though the party is 20 points behind. I think what tells me about that is the 2 by-election defeats that we had just last week. The fact that the reaction from Downing Street isn't, oh my God, what are we going to do? Panic stations. It's actually, no. Things are going to change in the next year. Inflation's coming down. Rwanda might be getting off the ground. All these other things. People need to just see that we're really, really good. It just tells me that actually they're going to play for time as much as they can. And so it's not going to be this side of Christmas. It might be autumn next year before the absolute final date of January 2025, but I'm sceptical that it's going to be anytime soon. Because
I think Rishi Sunak has hinted today that it would be
he celebrated his 1-year birthday in Downing Street with a video celebrating his own achievements, so I think he's pretty much, he wants to be there as much as he can.
If I was being really wicked, I would ask Stewart to list those achievements, but I'm not feeling wicked now.
Do it.
Rachel.
That would have been such fun.
I don't want you to list the achievements. I just want you to answer Callum's question.
You got nothing from me on Rishi's achievements. You can have a minute's silence. I can see where that question is coming from in terms of just, ripping off the Band-Aid, right? Just getting all the pain over with, because every time there's a by-election, it's humiliating for the Conservatives. But I actually think they are, they're a party of ideologues. And when you're right-wing ideologues, you want more time to deliver your right-wing ideological agenda.
Just when you're a politician, right? Politicians all want more time.
Yeah, but
do you see Rishi Sunak as an ideologue?
Keir Starmer has a particular agenda.
But his agenda is survival, so he would, of all people,
that's not a policy agenda. That's just staying in power for the hell of it. Whereas these guys, I think, these guys have got stuff to do. They've got stuff they want to do, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's changing the laws on whether we're members of, international legal frameworks, whether it's protest laws, whether it's tax things. They actually got stuff they believe in. I mean, it's totally counter to anything I believe in.
But obviously,
that makes me think that doesn't
mean to say that they're necessarily ideologues. I mean, I don't see Rishi Sunak as Liz Truss, I would say, was an ideologue, but I don't see Rishi Sunak.
Well, you're just having a reaction to the word. Let me put it a different way. They have a policy platform.
You used it.
I'm sorry I used it. I withdraw it. They have a policy platform that they want to deliver on. They're really into this policy platform.
Like any government would.
Well, again, I don't think... What's Keir Starmer's policy platform?
Don't ask me.
Well, there you go.
Stuart.
Well, I mean, am I in the same country as you, Rachel? I mean...
I doubt it, actually. That's the problem.
These are right-wing ideologues. You've got the record debt, record tax take, record number of civil servants, expanding the state, woke ideology running through most of our society.
You're in a different planet.
Private and public business,
Smoking ban.
smoking ban, attacks on property rights, the renters reform bill, the conversion therapy bill, which is a potential attack on parental rights, and these are right-wing ideologues. I mean, I just don't buy it. In terms of the substantial question, no politician wants to give up the red boxes, the limousines, the flunkies, the fancy conferences. They will go long, doesn't matter what party. I would caution Labour about being too cocky, though, because Starmer is not Blair. He's not genuinely popular. He's just not the Tories, which is not enough to survive even one parliament. And I would caution by saying that Blair had a lead, I think, at once in 1995 of 38%, and that closed to 13%. So, Keir Starmer's on a 20% lead now. It will close. The Tories will get their act together to a certain extent. And my guess is that Rishi Sunak will call the election on the back of a conference, or the Tory conference next October, because we've broken the duck recently on winter elections. I think there's no reason we can't have a mid-November election. And I think it will be closer. At the moment, the Tories will lose. I'm not convinced Labour will win overall majority.
There is a flaw in that argument.
Tell me what it is.
Because it's always been tradition that the Tories have the last conference. But this year and next year, it's Labour that has the last conference because they made a mistake in their bookings, and then so they had to do a little
Not
deal.
Tory incompetency, and
Labour incompetence. Sorry to break it to you, Ali, but it's Labour incompetence.
It was so easy to believe that.
I can't imagine Rishi Sunak finishing his conference speech, essentially saying, "We're gonna have an election and we're gonna win," and then allowing Keir Starmer the following week free publicity.
He wouldn't. That would be he'd get the King to call Parliament and dissolve Parliament. He wouldn't let Labour have a free hit of especially if they were heading the polls. But I think by that time it'll be sort of 10-12% lead, and then it could close.
What are you basing that on?
I'm not putting my mortgage on it.
It has happened before.
Yeah.
I mean, there is precedent for that, but I think it's a pretty desperate strategy to rely on.
Yeah, I mean, the Tories voters have gone on strike, and they've got to. All elections are hope versus fear, and the fear of Corbyn and the fear of not getting Brexit has gone. So they've got to offer hope if they're going to defeat Starmer.
Candidate a change. Again, that doesn't really work, does it? Ali Milani.
So I think on the question, it's felt like we've had 2 years of a general election just being fought in individual by-elections around the country. So, look, I don't think the Conservatives are going to recover. In fact, I think a lot of Conservatives are starting to act like opposition MPs already. I mean, I think Suella Braverman gave up being a serious politician and a serious Home Secretary a long time ago, and she's already running to be leader of the opposition. But actually, what I heard in your question was something very, very different, and that's we have another MP that's having to either resign or being suspended on misconduct allegations. There's some serious sickness in Westminster because we keep hearing it's sexual harassment, it's bullying, it's all sorts of misconduct that's going on. And we've had MP after MP resigned, suspended. And this is where I go back. In our previous sort of segment, we spoke about, let's take the morality out of it and focus on the politics. That's why we've gotten to where we are, is because we've so lowered the bar phenomenally for our MPs that we're allowing ourselves to just say, take the morality out of our MPs, take the humanity out of our MPs, take the right and wrong out of our MPs, to the point now where we've got MP after MP resigning or being suspended on some very serious, horrendous allegations that keep coming up and they're often found guilty of. I saw something where a young woman MP who'd walked in had been told who to not be in a room with alone in Westminster. How have we allowed this to happen?
I'm not going to name her, but I mean, she has been named in the papers. There's a female Labour MP who has a list of MPs that her colleagues should avoid being in the same room.
But it's interesting that, look, the question was asked, and rather than talking about the bullying allegation, we've all talked about the politics of it all. Where have we lost the I mean, this has to be the lowest standard of politicians at least I've ever had in my lifetime, because we can't have this many allegations and just breeze right past it.
But we've got a robust quasi-judicial system to deal with them now. I mean, my problem is not that this doesn't go on, because, I was in Parliament for 12 years. Of course, I knew people that behaved very badly. But we've now got a system where you are accused, you go through a system, but it's not judicial in respect of a proper appeal and openness and transparency for that person to defend their reputation and their livelihood. But I think if you are going to have a quasi-judicial system, you've got to have all parts of it.
The bit that bothers me, and I would say it, is post-Boris, post-Trump, there's been a serious lowering of the standard of public officials, I think. And it astounds me that the main headline out of this isn't the actual behaviour that consistently goes on in Westminster.
Well, we should note that Peter Bone continues to deny the allegations against him. You say there's a robust now quasi-judicial system, but the fact is, if it's a quasi-judicial system, the person who's being accused should at least have the right to defend themselves. He wasn't able to defend himself in this evening's vote to suspend him from Parliament.
But it's not just about him. I mean, we've had so...
It's not just about him, but I think if you were in that situation where if you were genuinely convinced of your own innocence and you weren't allowed to defend yourself, I mean, that is wrong.
And your accuser is anonymous.
And
it's 10 years ago.
What I have a concern about, again, I mean, is about the number we have had come out of Westminster. The scale of sexual harassment.
I used to say use the bad apples argument. Say, well, if you have 650 teachers or 650 nurses, there's going to be some bad apples. But over the last few years, we've had far too many.
But it's because we allow ourselves to say, let's take the humanity out of it, let's take the morality out of it, and just focus on politics. Like politics is a game of two football teams where you
Who's saying that?
Well,
you literally said it.
You literally said it in the last segment.
I said that I can't give you a values-based judgment on the Israel-Palestine view because I don't have enough.
No, that bit's fine.
You said let's take the morality out of it and focus on he's made a smart political choice. And
because I'm a political journalist, that's what I do as an analyst.
Yeah, I understand that, but what I'm saying is it's not just you doing it. I think that's become a culture.
But when it comes to that, but that's not the same as bullying.
No, but it is. It speaks to what happens when we're. No, it speaks to and it's not. I'm not addressing this to you personally. I'm talking about a wider culture in the way we look at politics and analyse politics, which is that it is devoid of that moral compass.
I think that is true.
That's completely untrue.
Well, there's
dozens and dozens of Labour, Liberal Democrat and Conservative MPs who are diligent, community-focused, hard-working people who care about improving the lives of millions of people. You will get these people who aren't like that in banking, in business, in charities, in the media. Look at the BBC. Not the BBC. Look at Savile. Look at all the other scandals at the BBC that were covered up. Now, to say all MPs like that. You said we've got no morality.
I'm talking about a culture.
And I don't agree.
I didn't say individuals. You didn't even let me finish before you decided to disagree. And that's the problem.
You said
I would love to continue with this, but we're way beyond news time, so we must do that first, and then we may continue, or we will continue with something afterwards. Whether it's on this, I don't know. It's 8:33. News headlines on LBC with Charlotte Morgan.
The head of the UN says he's shocked at accusations. He's justifying terrorism by saying the Hamas attacks on Gaza didn't happen in a vacuum. Antonio Guterres says he's always been clear nothing could ever excuse or explain the horror of what happened. The former Conservative MP, Peter Bone, has been suspended from the House of Commons for 6 weeks. He was found to have committed sexual misconduct and bullying against a staff member. And Mike Johnson, an ally of Donald Trump, has been elected Speaker of the US House of Representatives. They've been without one of the most powerful political positions for 3 weeks. LBC weather, showers moving northeastwards across the country tonight with a low of 6.
This is LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Rachel, Shabi, Ali Milani, Stewart Jackson and Cindy Yu answering your calls and texts. We have the shortest text question I think we've ever had here from Olivia in Barking. Has anything really changed in the Metropolitan Police? Now, 2 Metropolitan Police officers were sacked today after being found guilty of gross misconduct for lying about their stop and search of the professional athletes Bianca Williams and Ricardo dos Santos in the summer of 2020. Now, the officers falsely claimed that they could smell cannabis during the search of the couple's car. However, they and 3 other officers were cleared of racially profiling them, which seems extraordinary to me, but there we go. We've had all sorts of comments about the Metropolitan Police's policing of various protests over the past few weeks. We've had today people being filmed ripping down posters of the hostages in Israel, and the police saying, well, that's perfectly okay, no crime has been committed. The Metropolitan Police, it seems, I think a lot of people think, are incapable of change. Rachel, do you think anything's really changed in the Met, as Olivia wants to know?
No. Because it's a culture. And to change a culture, you've got to first acknowledge that you've got a problem with your culture.
Going back to the last question, aren't we?
Because these things, that's what it means when you have a culture. That's why you get people saying, oh, but it's just a few people and most people are good and it's just a few bad apples. That's why that response never works when we're talking about a cultural problem, because it's not about individuals. It's about an organisation. It's about an institution that it's in its practices, in its DNA, enables these things to go on. And that takes work. But the first part of that work is to admit that that's what it is. And the Met, unfortunately, is still stuck in that place where it cannot admit that and will not admit that. And until it can, we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to keep seeing horrible stories like this and worse.
Cindy?
Yeah, I mean, we had a report on earlier this year, didn't we, about all the different ways in which just even basic crime,
cases.
Absolutely, basic crime wasn't getting solved. Female police officers being harassed, bullied, or just junior police officers, just a total abuse of power in any which way you can think of. And I think I'm right in saying that the Met pretty much just rejected it and didn't acknowledge that was.
I think that's a distortion of what happened. I mean, they recognised that things needed to change. Now the question is, have they made those changes quickly enough?
But I have not heard of... I mean, Mark Rowley, the new commissioner, has basically said, we're not going to go for the woke stuff now, which is fine, and some people want that. We're going to go for the more base-level crime. But what about these abuses of power that leads to 2 black people going around London being questioned for apparently no reason? I don't know. I don't see the changes. I don't know, Iain, if you can offer those up either, because I don't know if they're focusing on that. I mean, yes, to some extent, burglary is great. Let's start solving that, because that is fundamentally what the police are for as well. But there are other things going on over here, and I don't see anything active going on. But perhaps that's because...
Okay, Stewart?
Well, I've been embarrassed to a certain extent to see the way they have policed some of these demonstrations. But, I mean, that's anecdotal, and it doesn't really speak to the bigger issue, the generational issue, which is that there are always going to be issues and cultural issues with a force of 32,000 people policing the biggest city in Europe, multicultural, multiracial, urban and semi-rural suburbs. It is very, very difficult. I think Mark Rowley's doing the best job he can. It's not true that the Casey report was rejected. There have always been issues. In the 70s and 80s, it was about corruption and, bent coppers. Obviously, post Stephen Lawrence, the appalling murder of Stephen Lawrence in Eltham, there was the issue of institutional racism. I do think that Met has taken that seriously and has made progress in the way it's recruited more BME officers and staff, and also women. But there's more work to do. And I think the important thing is, unlike many, many jurisdictions across the world, we know that these officers are bad apples. We know they've been brought to justice by internal procedures. I would say, though, we probably need to look at the model of how you govern the Met Police. I'm not sure the mayoral model and the Greater London Assembly is the right model, but that's for another day. But I think it's unfair to say the Met aren't making changes. Whether they're making them more as quickly as they should is another matter.
Ali?
I think there's a crisis in confidence. I think there's a real crisis in our communities where large swathes of our communities, the data suggests this, the reality experiences suggest this, do not trust the police. I grew up my whole life not trusting the police. We used to have a police officer outside of our school. Not once did we see them as part and parcel of the solution. We were afraid of them. They often, we had to deal with stop and searches all the time, and it fed an atmosphere of mistrust, of an atmosphere of anxiety towards the police. And I think nothing has changed in that regard now that I'm sat here at nearly 30 years old. Whether it's people from ethnic minority backgrounds, black men specifically, whether it's women following the Sarah Everard vigil and how that was policed specifically was seen. I think large parts of our community do not trust the police, do not feel safe in police hands, and that's an issue that we have to seriously address. The concern I have around this is I've not been in the political game that long, but been here fairly long enough to know that it's almost impossible to have an honest discussion about the police in our political world because of the sort of grandstanding that politicians often do. They feel like they have to either be pro-police or anti-police. I think that's a really problematic position to have. We need to address the fact that, yes, there is institutional racism in the police, in the Metropolitan Police. I don't think anyone in this world can deny that now. There is a huge problem that was reported in the report mentioned earlier around the treatment of officers, and unless we're going to be brave enough to call that out and have that conversation, then nothing's ever going to be fixed. I'm going to be back here when I'm 50 talking also about how there's no confidence in the police, how broken the stop and search system is, it doesn't even work, and how essentially our communities, and policing by consent is supposed to be the model, has just disappeared.
It does work if it's done proportionately.
Stop and search?
Yeah.
The data's wrong.
No,
the
data's not wrong. It's done proportionally.
I'm not going to... I mean, we can have the quarrel about whether
you're talking about grandstanding, you've said anti-police, pro-police. You've just had 2 minutes being anti-police. So
that wasn't anti-police. I just want the right police.
No, you're just saying it's we're broken and the police are institutionally
racist.
Let's do this. I think that's anti-police.
To be fair, I did not interpret what Ali said as being anti-police.
No, can I just
finish my point about disproportionality?
Answer this one question for me. How many times in your life have you been stopped and searched?
When I was a student, but that's 30 years ago, admittedly.
I'm 30 years old. You've got a few years on me. I've been stopped and searched over 11 times in my life.
No, but what I'm saying is...
This is our different experiences with police, Alex, and this is what I'm saying. If you don't listen to experiences like mine, my community, we can't fix this problem.
But it's not crime. Crime affects black and minority ethnic communities, and many people in those communities, if they're consulted and respected by local police, borough commanders, for instance, they support stop and search, providing it's evidence-based and proportionate. But to write it off is wrong.
But all the data and reports, and there's more than one that's been done, shows it doesn't lead to increased prosecutions within communities of real crime, and all it does is fester division and mistrust between communities and the police. So, I mean, we have very differences of opinion, but the reality is...
You're not suggesting it should be abolished, are you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, you are?
Absolutely, it should be abolished. It doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. It doesn't lead to prosecutions, and all it does is make people like me growing up fearful of the police.
Yeah, but what about county lines? What about young black boys who face the prospect of being assaulted and stabbed to death? I mean,
but there's ways to police that
without... If one person is saved by a stop and search of someone with a knife, then surely that's worth doing. I don't disagree with you necessarily. Of course there are abuses, but the key word is proportionality.
But if you're actually looking at communities where sort of changes in policing have worked, where it's worked most effectively is when I think you mentioned it, when you win the trust of the local community, especially young people in my area, and people give up the knives themselves. That's where it's worked most effectively, and where the research suggests it works most effectively. In fact, actually, what I'm really glad about is the spirit of the debate we're having here is what should be happening all over.
We agree.
Being able to tackle these issues. My fear has always been, I'll be honest, when I was a candidate, I'll hold my hands up right now, I was too scared to talk about police, right, when I was a candidate in Uxbridge and South Ruislip.
See, that should never be the case.
I 100% was it. The only time it was raised, there was unfortunately a death in Hillingdon, and then we had to really seriously talk about policing. But I was petrified because I couldn't say what my experience was, what I really felt.
Because you thought the media would write it up as being anti-police.
Yeah, I couldn't talk about my experience because then I would then be called anti-police. And I'm
I get where you're coming from, because we talk about policing on this programme quite a lot, and I've been very, very critical of particularly the Metropolitan Police, and I'm somebody who instinctively supports the police. But when you have all these scandals, you can't cover them up. You have to cover them, and you have to give your honest views on why they've happened and what should then be done. But I hate it when I then get texts from police officers saying, "What we do a really difficult job. Why are you being anti us?" And of course I'm saying, "Well, I'm not."
It's not.
But you've got to recognise that you, not personally, but you as an institution, have a problem, and therefore you have to deal with it. And if we just cover it up, well, it doesn't get anybody anywhere, does it? It's 8:47.
LBC. Paint your Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
Let's give the last word on our policing discussion to Frank in Ruislip, who says, such a shame that people that constantly bitch about the police never have the guts to put on the uniform and try to make a change and be a role model. Just cowards. Well, we stand admonished for that. Now, we've got a text here from our good friend Oz Chatterjee, who's a journalist who's been on the programme many times before. He's now living in Ukraine, but he's listening. And he says, please send my regards to your guests. They have all spoken well. But it drives me crazy to hear the phrase "a few bad apples" without hearing the end of it, spoil the broth. The whole point of the phrase is that a few bad people are enough to bring an entire institution down. Right, let's go to another caller. It's Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Ian, and hello, panel. The question is the UK at risk of losing its dominance as a financial hub since large companies are now choosing Wall Street over the city?
There are quite a few companies choosing the city over European exchanges, aren't there? It's not all one-way traffic.
No, but there was a report today, Bloomberg was talking about it as well, that it looks like a trend.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't want to gainsay Bloomberg. Now, ARM, which designs microchips for devices from smartphones to games consoles, is based in Cambridge, but has decided to list its shares on the Nasdaq in New York rather than in London. I've no idea what factors are based on that they base that decision on. Stewart Jackson used to be MP for Peterborough, not far from Cambridge, so I'm coming to you first.
Yeah, I represented the largest city in Cambridgeshire. I'm not sure I agree with the caller, to be honest, because I think the recent data showed that the level of transactions in the city was the highest ever, and that in terms of foreign direct investment, it was going up again. It was still significantly higher than, say, Germany, France and Italy. So I think there will be different interpretations of data. I mean, I think, given the prophet of doom, people took the attitude that, Brexit would be a disaster for the city. Very few jobs have been lost, and actually it's not been the case. The city is still thriving.
And I remember Unilever, I think they decided to list on the Dutch stock exchange rather than the British one. And then in the last 2 years, they've changed that decision and come back to London. Yeah. So I haven't got the stats in front of me, so I can't. But I have heard of other companies listing in America rather than here. But I mean, New York has always been, well, I say always, certainly in recent decades, has always been the biggest financial centre in Europe. Rachel? In the world, sorry.
I cannot speak to it on the level of London Stock Exchange and Wall Street, because I am not an expert in that, and I'm not even going to pretend to be, because that would just insult the panel and your listeners. But the economy that I look at is whether this economy is working for this country. And to me, that answer is very clearly no. It is not.
But it's going off the subject, so...
I'm just saying, we've just got record levels of poverty, and that's a problem for any economy.
Let's go to the other panelists, because then we can squeeze in another question as well. Cindy?
Well, ARM is a semiconductor company, and I wonder if part of the reason going to America is because of America's tussle of war with China on semiconductor industry. So last October, this time last year, America put in this massive subsidies package called the CHIPS Act, which basically is just, as I say, subsidies for semiconductor companies, followed by subsidies for renewable energy companies in the Inflation Reduction Act. And from my conversations with industry leaders, it does seem like that's making a massive difference to whether or not people stay in the UK or Europe in general, as opposed to going to America. And for Washington, the big problem here is China. They're trying to cut China out of supply chains for these high-tech industries. But in the process, it also cuts the EU and the UK out as well. So I wonder if that's also, I don't know exactly about ARM, but I think that's part of the reason. And you know what? The UK can't beat America and China when it comes to subsidies. So we've got to do other things like cutting our deregulating or cutting taxes. We're also losing out to Ireland when it comes to other companies like Amazon and AstraZeneca. So we've got to do what we're good at. That's not going to be massive subsidies, but this is the world we're in now, where protectionism is very much in vogue, and we've got two giant powers fighting for the brightest and the best businesses, and the UK kind of squeezed in the middle unless we can be more clever about it. And that's why the AI summit coming up is actually quite exciting.
Big speech from Rishi Sunak tomorrow on AI. I have to say, whenever I hear the phrase AI, I want to switch off. But that's still
from Rishi Sunak.
Absolutely. Ali?
Well, we've almost gone 55 minutes before someone said Brexit, didn't we? And I'm afraid
it's quite good given Stewart's here.
Yeah, I might have to say. I think, look, I definitely think Brexit has had a huge impact, at least in the faith and confidence that many companies hold. Particularly, I mean, you mentioned AstraZeneca. We know that there were, at least, if not still, a lot of anxieties from pharmaceutical companies and the regulation. Even
they've gone to Ireland because of corporation tax rates. Nothing to do with Brexit.
No, not them specifically, but we heard, I think, in the last 3 years, specifically post-COVID, that there was a huge amount of anxieties around pharmaceutical companies. But I don't think, hopefully it's not too controversial to say that I think Brexit has had a significant impact. Whether we've lost a little bit of jobs or a lot of jobs, there's certainly a huge amount of faith and confidence. And I think a lot of the issue as well is they want stable markets. And I think post-Brexit, now some might say that it will recover and that stability will come, but post-Brexit, I think there has been a huge amount of volatility both in our economy, in our politicians, and in our markets, and that's not conducive to investment.
Right. Neil in Chorlton in Greater Manchester says, have the Conservatives only ditched their renters' reforms because so many of their own MPs are landlords? You've each got about 30 seconds, maybe 40 if I'm generous. Cindy?
It's a shame because
As the young person on the panel.
Well, yeah, as a young person on the panel, I think housing is the biggest thing that they need to tackle, not smoking reforms, not net zero. They need to fix housing, and, it's a shame. I think a lot of them forget what it's like to be a renter because they haven't rented in so many years.
What about the landlord issue? Because it does seem that quite a proportion of the MPs that have scuppered this do seem to be landlords.
Yeah, they do, don't they?
But I mean, that goes back to our previous question, doesn't it? Sort of on morality in politics.
Yeah, but it's also about experience in politics. All of our worldviews and much of our politics is shaped by our own personal experiences. And I think, as hopefully the other young person on the panel, I think I'm still young, not having that experience of renting.
You just look older than she does.
Yeah, definitely. The white hairs, the last 12 days will do that to you. But I think not having that experience of renting in this market. I mean, look, I recently just got married, and the concept of owning a home with my wife is one that we can't even fathom right now. And if a government isn't going to solve that as a number one critical issue, what is it going to solve?
That's really disappointing to hear, isn't it? Because when I was your age...
we're not even having the conversation, Ian. It's like it's so beyond the realms of possibility.
But when I was your age, it would have been a natural thing to do. I mean, people would... they actually wouldn't have got married if they couldn't have
But the market,
to buy
the renting market, again, they don't have this... The renting market is so ludicrous in London right now, for example, that people are paying to view properties to rent into. So they're just paying for the opportunity to view a property. That's how serious the situation is.
Rachel?
I agree. A fifth of Conservative MPs are landlords, I believe, so it's worth just...
Which is not a crime in itself, we should say.
It's not a crime, but it's obviously going to have an impact.
Being a landlord myself, of only one property, though...
It's not necessarily a negative impact, right? Because some of the arguments they're making is that some of the stuff in the rental reform bill would have made it very difficult for landlords to, keep their properties, would have driven up rents. I can see kind of the argument there, but there must be a way to balance both interests.
I just think reform should prioritise renters always, just as a basis.
Okay, Stewart.
As a basic.
I think
what we've just said.
Section 21 abolition will have unintended consequences. It will reduce the supply. I really do, and I've really serious issues about it. But I have to say, both parties have let young people down on housing. I deplore the NIMBY campaign in mid-Bedfordshire. By both parties, we're not going to build on the blessed green belt. We really need to think about the fact that people are getting to almost 40 before they've even got deposit to buy a house. I'm a Conservative because I want to share opportunity and share capital. I don't want to be in a party that hoards capital for the lucky few. It's wrong, it's immoral. Both parties have to change.
You're in the wrong party then.
Okay. We haven't got much time, and I do want to finish with this final question from Tammy in Liverpool. Stormzy held a last-minute impromptu gig up here last night in front of only 500 people. What's the best exclusive event you've managed to get into? Rachel, I'm coming to you first because I imagine you mix with the stars.
I wish. I can't think of anything, but that one sounds amazing. I wish I could have cited that one as
I've given
mine.
you 10 minutes notice and you can't think of any big event that you've managed to...
Because I don't have any.
Stewart, rescue
Well, I'm
us.
really looking forward to seeing ABC play Lexicon of Love at the Palladium in February.
Oh, that'd be
really
amazing.
excited. Going to wear my gold lame suit
I don't want to see that.
from Martin Fry. But no, seriously, I went to a noble, eminent lord's birthday party not that long ago, and the secret guest that was unveiled was Michael Bublé. Had been floated all the way over from Vancouver, had a top suite and flew back the next day, and it was a wonderful concert.
Can't stand Michael Bublé. Ali?
I'm going to break some news for you, Ian. I in a different life, I used to be a professional wrestler. And and I've got some friends who work at the WWE, and when Money in the Bank was in town in London...
I did think at one point you might launch yourself across the panel.
Just a frog splash right in the middle of the table, but I was able to go almost ringside at Money in the Bank, so that was really exciting.
When I was a parliamentary candidate, I got to compare a wrestling match in Sheringham in Norfolk.
Right, Iain Dale versus Ali Milani for charity.
I compared it. I didn't take part in it.
No, it's not really.
Cindy, beat that.
Oh, the 10-minute notice hasn't given me anything good either. The most exciting thing I went to recently was a Prospect summer party where they had canapes, unlike the normal Spectator summer party, which just never has food.
Well, you've kind of let me down, so I'm going to have my own one here. I got backstage when Sparks did a concert at the Barbican. And you're all thinking, who is Spark?
Yeah.
Ron and Russell Mail.
They're too young.
This Talent Big Enough for the Both of Us, the number one song in heaven.
Yeah.
That was them.
I wouldn't have told you who'd done it, but yeah.
One hit wonder.
Well, no, they weren't one-hit wonders. They're still going, and they're fantastic, honestly. Right. Thank you very much indeed to you all for coming in today. Let's tell you who's on Monday's panel. The Conservative MP and Home Affairs Select Committee Chair Tim Lawton, the former Labour MP Mary Cray, the political YouTuber Maya Tusi, and LBC's very own Natasha Devon. Thank you very much indeed to Cindy, to Ali, to Rachel and to Stewart. Now, coming up in the next hour, too many people are still dying from sepsis due to the same mistakes highlighted more than 10 years ago, according to the UK's Health Ombudsman. Rob Behrens, who handles complaints about the NHS, said sepsis diagnosis and treatment was taking too long. The UK Sepsis Trust estimates about 48,000 people die each year from sepsis-related illnesses, thousands of which are preventable. NHS England said it was working to improve sepsis management, as well they might. I want to know what effect sepsis has had on your family, because I remember interviewing Jason Watkins, the actor, about 10 years ago about the death of his daughter, and it's one of the most emotional interviews I've ever done. So I want to hear from you.
Radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. Muslim Labour MPs are urging Sir Keir Starmer to call for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The Labour leader has joined Rishi Sunak and the US in backing humanitarian pauses to deliver aid to Gaza, but has supported Israel's right to defend itself. Previous comments made by Sir Keir over cutting off water